Sometimes when you're watching a football game and you see a team with a quarterback who just doesn't know when to get rid of the ball, you can't help but feel bad for the offensive line. As a Seahawks fan myself, I've witnessed many plays where Russell Wilson just holds on to the ball forever and eventually takes a sack because he didn't get rid of it quicker. This goes down as a sack against the offensive line, but it wasn't really their fault. I wanted to create something that would be able to separate sacks into sacks caused by the offensive line and sacks caused by the quarterback. And I did this using pressures, which is actually a better indicator of sacks in the future than sacks. Here's a chart of how many sacks each offensive line would have given up in the 2020 regular season, and it's adjusted for the amount of snaps played. That way, if an offensive line gives up the same amount of sacks as another offensive line in more or less pass blocking snaps, it's not considered the same. As you can see here, the offensive lines performed around the general expectation of what people put on these teams, with teams like the Saints, Colts, and Bucks having some of the top offensive lines in the league, and teams like the Jets, Texans, and Eagles being near the bottom. There were a few surprises, however, that most people didn't know, like the Broncos, Cardinals, and Chargers having offensive lines that are decently high, as well as offensive lines like the Cowboys, Ravens, and Patriots being lower than expected. My method, which I'll go in depth in at the end, basically found the average pressure to sack rate, which holds up over time, and then divided the QB's pressure to sack rate by that average sack rate before multiplying that number to the QB's sacks, which allowed me to find sacks that were completely on the offensive line. Here's a chart of what those new numbers look like for sacks that were completely on the offensive line, and I'm going to call these O-line sacks. There's a lot of movement from the last graph, with notable moves being the Cowboys going from slightly below average to almost top 5, and the Dolphins jumping into the top 8, as well as the Panthers and Lions moving significantly up. Some notable move downs were the Chiefs and Chargers both falling 13 plus spots, and the 49ers who moved from middle of the pack all the way to last place. Before you think about anything else in the chart, here's another graph that puts things into more context. Looking at this, it may be easy to get overwhelmed, but I'll explain it. The x-axis shows their actual sack total, which matches the first chart shown, with teams all the way on the left giving up the least sacks and increasing as it moves to the right. The y-axis matches the second chart, and the best offensive lines by this measure are at the bottom, and they worsen as you move up the graph. The number 30 is close to the average for both sacks and O-line sacks, so I used that as a center so it's easy to visualize. The red line represents an offensive line that's the same in sacks and O-line sacks, meaning that the quarterback doesn't have any effect on the offensive line's production. Some teams like the Cardinals, Browns, Bears, and Washington football team with Alex Smith embodied this. Anything above or to the left of the line means that the offensive line was helped out by the quarterback and may not be as good as we think. Anything below or to the right of the red line means that the quarterback may have been hurting the offensive line play and the offensive line may not be as bad as shown. Remember that no matter where a team is located on the graph, it can be looked at as a double-edged sword. If a team is above the line, you can look at it as either the offensive line is overrated or the quarterback is doing a great job. If the team is below the line, you can look at it as either the offensive line is underrated or the quarterback is doing a bad job. In both scenarios, both conditions hold true. One thing that you may have noticed off the bat is that teams that are leftward of the x-axis tend to be above the line, and those rightward of the x-axis tend to be below the line. This is because for a team to be on the left, they have to give up a very little amount of sacks, which needs a combination of good offensive line play and good quarterback escapability. Or else, bad quarterback escapability would put them closer to the right side. The opposite holds true on the other side, with teams giving up a lot of sacks, having bad quarterback play in terms of sacks, because without that QB, they may not have been as bad. There's a lot of interesting information that we could take away from this graph. First, we can look at two teams, the Cowboys and Buccaneers. The Cowboys and Buccaneers along the y-axis, which is my stat, O-line sacks, shows that the Cowboys and Buccaneers are about the same. But when you look at them along the x-axis, it shows that the Bucs have performed much better. My stat shows that the Bucs and Cowboys played about the same because of Brady elevating his line and Dalton making his offensive line look worse, but at face value, the Bucs look like they had the much better offensive line. For a team like the Washington football team, with Alex Smith and Dwayne Haskins, it looks like the offensive lines played similar with regular sacks along the x-axis, but the difference in y-axis shows that they actually played much better when Haskins was the QB. yet Haskins' inability to avoid sacks make them look the same over both parts of the year. The Dolphins' offensive line was a more extreme version of this. At face value, it looks like the Dolphins' offensive line played better with Fitzpatrick at quarterback, but in reality, they played like one of the best offensive lines in the league when Tua was their quarterback. But Tua was so bad at avoiding pressures that it looked like the line played below average. The line in Miami was sneaky good this year, especially over the second half of the year, but unfortunately because of Tua, they were not able to get the recognition they deserved. Another team's offensive line that looked significantly worse because of the quarterback was the Eagles, and although Hurts did not qualify for this exercise, the line certainly did better with him under center, not taking unnecessary sacks like Wentz. The 49ers were a massive outlier the other way, boosting their offensive line the most, with the quarterback play of Nick Mullins, which is actually more likely to be attributed to Shanahan than Mullins. And if we take a look around the league, some other guys known to be top play callers like Shanahan, McVay, and Andy Reid are all above the line, while guys who had terrible years play calling, like Doug Peterson and Adam Gase, were well below the line. I'll explain how play calling affects QB sacks later. Other teams whose offensive lines looked significantly better because of quarterback play were the Steelers, likely because of Ben's tendency to throw quickly, the Broncos, likely because of Locke's tendency to throw the ball at the first sign of pressure, and the Chargers, because of Herbert's ability to escape the pocket and also his tendency to throw the ball early when pressured. Out of the teams I highlighted earlier that were above people's expectations on the first chart, the Broncos and Chargers offensive lines were overrated while the Cardinals offensive line held up, which makes me believe that the Cardinals were actually one of the best pass-blocking offensive lines in the league last year, while the Chargers and Broncos are closer to what people think and not as good as the sacks at face value say they are. Teams that I highlighted as below people's expectation were the Cowboys, Ravens, and Patriots. While the Ravens and Patriots had offensive lines that were better than what was shown, they didn't significantly improve. The Cowboys, however, had a massive jump and may have even played better than people's perception. Teams like the Packers, Colts, Bucks, and Saints had slightly inflated offensive lines, but that's natural when teams are allowing that little amount of sacks, and these offensive lines were still some of the best in the league. The Falcons were right about average and had an overrated offensive line because of how good their QB play was in terms of evading sacks. The Vikings were the only team with a well worse than average offensive line to deserve more sacks because they got good QB play in terms of avoiding sacks. They were one of the worst pass-blocking offensive lines in the league. Now that we've seen the offensive line aspect, let's look at the quarterback perspective. We can simply find QB sacks by finding the difference in sacks and O-line sacks. Any number that comes out as negative is a sack saved, and any number that comes out as positive is a sack that was directly caused because of the QB. Note that the average will always be 0 because this is the amount of sacks saved or sacks cost above average. Here you can see some of the top guys for this stat are Mullins, Mahomes, Herbert, Roethlisberger, and Locke. The bottom 5 consist of Sam Darnold, Gardner Minshew, Dwayne Haskins, Carson Wentz, and Tua Tagovailoa. As we can see here, some of these players are considered to be some of the worst QBs in the league, like Haskins, Wentz, and Darnold, who are near the bottom. Tua is also in last place, which further supports my opinion that the Dolphins should trade Tua. It also changes my thought that Gardner Minshew could be a decent quarterback for some team, to Gardner Minshew could be a solid backup for some team. Perhaps, instead of looking at aggregate numbers, we should look at percentages, because saving 5 sacks when you should be sacked 100 times is not the same as saving 5 sacks when you should be sacked 5 times. Keep in mind that negative percentages means a percent more sacks a team would have had if they had an average quarterback, and positive percentages mean the percentage of sacks that player is taking up. As you can see here, some of the top guys are players like Roethlisberger, Fitzpatrick, and Brady. Josh Allen, Jared Goff, and Drew Brees round out the top 10. Phillip Rivers, Ryan Tannehill, and Derek Carr are also quarterbacks who did a pretty good job of avoiding sacks. Foles was also solid in his limited snaps. Kirk Cousins, Aaron Rodgers, and Matt Ryan finish out the last quarterbacks who are still helping their team's offensive lines. Baker, Kyler, and Alex Smith are net zeros to their team's offensive lines, and Russell Wilson is the smallest negative to his team while still being a negative. Some quality QBs like Watson, Lamar, and Matt Stafford are all negative to their teams in this 4th tier. This is because these guys oftentimes try to be the hero and hold on to the ball longer than they should, similar to Wilson, who is ranked a little bit higher. and now we're at some of the worst quarterbacks in this stat, and it actually matches up with some of the worst quarterbacks in the league. A lot of these guys are younger quarterbacks, and 5 out of 7 of these quarterbacks were drafted in the last 3 years, with the other 2 quarterbacks being Carson Wentz and Andy Dalton. One thing I was excited to do was see what categories of quarterback had a strong correlation with QB sacks. The first category was the best quarterbacks in the league, and I surprisingly could not draw any conclusion from that category. The quarterbacks were evenly distributed, with 3 quarterbacks being in the top half, 3 quarterbacks being in the bottom half, and Aaron Rodgers almost squarely in the middle. My next category was the worst quarterbacks in the league, and this was more telling. Some of the worst quarterbacks in the league, with the exception of Nick Foles, were all in the bottom 6 of the league in this stat. The guys who are the worst of the worst in this stat have no good players in the tier, while just one tier above, there's guys like Deshaun Watson and Lamar Jackson, who are still hurting their teams but are a great quarterback. The fact that all of these bad QBs are grouped together makes me think even worse of all of them, and makes me think less of Tua, who finished last in O-line sacks. The next category was youngest quarterbacks, and rather than go by age, I went by years of experience in the league, and all of these guys were drafted in the last 2 years' draft classes. A couple of them, Drew Lock, Justin Herbert, did extremely well, while the rest were towards the bottom of the league. Like the top QBs, I wasn't able to come up with any definitive takeaway from this category. Another thing I wanted to check, and the entire reason that I created this statistic, was to see how well mobile QBs did, and they did almost exactly what I expected. Josh Allen was the only one above average, although the Bills have tried to have Allen sit in the pocket and take more hits this year, rather than utilize his mobility, which may be the reason why he's higher than the rest of his fellow mobile quarterbacks. For guys like Wilson and Watson, every play where they escape pockets that no one else can, there's another play where they take an unnecessary sack. They're not at the bottom of the league because of the sacks they escape, but it perfectly proves my hypothesis that mobile quarterbacks are overrated in terms of avoiding sacks, and that they cause more harm than they solve. The next category I looked at was older QBs, which juxtaposed my last category of the most mobile QBs, and these gave me definitive proof of my hypothesis. These guys do not rely on their mobility to escape pockets, and they'd rather use their smarts to identify pressure and get rid of the ball quickly to avoid sacks. The guy who tries to utilize his mobility most on this list is Aaron Rodgers, and he finishes at the bottom of this list. This screams out to me that smarts are more important than mobility when trying to avoid sacks. It also helps that these guys were good enough to last in the league this many years. The last category I tested, which I wasn't even thinking of before I noticed it in the data, was looking at teams with some of the best play callers. Kyle Shanahan and Sean McVay are known as the undisputed 2 best offensive play callers in the game, and both of their quarterbacks finished in the top 10, with Shanahan's quarterback finishing second overall. Some great play callers who were offensive coordinators, like Brian Daboll and Arthur Smith, finished pretty highly in this category, making me think they will be good NFL head coaches when it comes to the X's and O's aspect. Out of these play callers, McVay, Daboll, Smith, Reed, and Matt LaFleur were all top 6 in play action and performed well in this stat. This makes me think that QB sack percentage can actually be used to identify good play callers in the league. Final takeaways. This stat taught me a lot of important things in the process, and I'd like to share some of my takeaways. For one thing, I never really noticed how good the Cardinals' offensive line was, but they finished top 10 in actual sacks and top 5 in O-line sacks, which makes me think that their offensive line is legit and is not boosted by Kyler Murray's mobility at all. Another takeaway for me is that former Chargers offensive coordinator Shane Steichen is an extremely underrated candidate. When Seattle brought him in to interview for their open offensive coordinator position, I didn't know much about him other than the fact that he was the Chargers offensive coordinator. But now, with some of the top play callers having quarterbacks that have negative sack percentages, and Steichen having a quarterback with the same, as well as Steichen using play action, the 7th most in the league, another thing in common with top play callers, I'm starting to think Steichen is a legit offensive coordinator candidate, and some teams should look to bring him in. Another coordinator that I have a greater appreciation for is offensive coordinator Pat Shurmur of the Broncos. I thought of him highly even after he was fired by the Giants. After this year, however, I wasn't so sure about Shurmur. but seeing Locke and Shurmur perform well in this category makes me think that both of them deserve another year to develop chemistry before the Broncos find a new quarterback and or offensive coordinator. Some offensive coordinators that I think less of now are Kellen Moore and Joe Brady. I never really saw the hype around Moore, and with Dalton doing terrible in this statistic, I don't see him as a legit offensive coordinator, much less a head coach. Joe Brady, on the other hand, didn't perform as bad. However, the Panthers didn't do anything special offensively, which makes me think that teams should pump the brakes and wait another year to hire Joe Brady. Doug Peterson was heavily criticized for his bad play calling with Wentz this season, and this stat further shows that. I believe that the Eagles made the right decision to let him go. One coach I believe should have been fired, but was not, was Zach Taylor of the Cincinnati Bengals. He didn't do much in this category to create plays for Burrow to escape pressure, and I never really liked the hire in the first place. I don't like the track record either, and this is the last straw for me. By keeping Taylor, if this doesn't work out, next year Burrow's going to have one less year with a new coach. Another thing I believed before, and believe even more now, is that the Lions should get rid of offensive coordinator Darrell Bevell, whose play calling has never been great, and with him failing to utilize Stafford, he needs to go. The last thing is something I'm very passionate about, even before this, is that the Dolphins should trade quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, whether that be in a package for Watson or whether that be for picks, using the third pick in the draft to draft a QB. His ceiling is pretty low, and I don't think his floor is all that high either, and with his sack percentage being grouped with the likes of Sam Darnold, Dwayne Haskins, and Carson Wentz, I don't think Tua is a franchise quarterback that can win a Super Bowl, even with the Dolphins' great roster, and I think the Dolphins can move off him. My method. The stats in green were given to me by Pro Football Reference, and the rest I created using the stats that were given. First, I found dropbacks for each QB, which surprisingly weren't given. I did this by adding pass attempts, scrambles, and sacks, because those are the only three results that can happen on any given dropback. I found the average weighted sack percentage by dividing pressures and sacks for each quarterback before then multiplying by the amount of dropbacks they had. I added all of these up and divided by the number of quarterbacks in the data, which was 35. I also found the attempts over average for each quarterback by dividing the average amount of dropbacks by the amount of dropbacks for each QB. This will be used as a multiplier for QBs later. I created unfinished line sacks, or U-line sacks, by taking the sack to pressure rate and dividing that by the average weighted sack percentage. I multiplied this by the amount of sacks to get U-line sacks. From there, all I had to do was multiply by the AOAV, and I got O-line sacks. By subtracting sacks from O-line sacks, I was able to create QB sacks, and by dividing QB sacks from sacks, I found the sack percentages for each QB. That's pretty much it for this statistic. I really hope that you guys found this statistic and its uses interesting.
For more creative, informative, and high-quality sports content, make sure to follow Phenom on TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as all of the Phenom podcast channels for each sport. The link tree in the episode description includes a direct link to all of the aforementioned platforms, so click on that to access everything. Phenom boasts a team of over 100 youth contributors from around the world, covering every sport on every media platform. If you are interested in potentially joining the Phenom team as a writer or content creator, send an email to cole@phenommedia.net showing your interest. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so we can grow the channel. We really appreciate it. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.